This is for the third graders this morning. So, we are going to listen to chapter 3, and it's titled Joe of Sideways Stories from Wayside School. So, we'll listen to chapter 3 and we will listen on Audible. So, I'm not going to be reading to you this time. I'm using an app called Audible, and I own the Audible book of it, so I'm just going to kind of let you listen to that because I think it's sometimes fun to listen to a professional reader read on Audible. Um, so think about last time I asked you to think about the way that you're reading and if you're reading with expression. Um, this time you're going to get an example of the right way to read or the professional way. So I want you to think about if your reading is matching up to the way that the professional reader is reading. Now, if you're not a complete professional like this man, that's okay. Mrs. Grimm, I don't think, is a professional either completely. So usually, to read like a professional, you have to read a few times. So, my challenge to you is listen to chapter 3 from the professional and then go ahead on your own and try and read it like the professional read it. So, notice kind of the things that he does to keep you entertained. Okay, and then afterwards, we have a couple questions, and I will record chapter 4 on Wednesday. Tomorrow, Tuesday, um, we will be doing a Zoom. So if you would like to ask me any questions, or if you have some things you want to say about the book or how your break has been going, any of those things are fine. We're going to do a short, probably 20-minute Zoom on Tuesday, tomorrow at noon. I'll make sure that that's a good time. Yeah, I think noon. So, all right, I will see you all in a bit. All right, let me make this bigger.
Joe. Joe had curly hair, but he didn't know how much hair he had. He couldn't count that high. In fact, he couldn't count at all. When all of the other children went to recess, Mrs. Jules told Joe to wait inside. "Joe," she said, "how much hair do you have?" Joe shrugged his shoulders. "A lot," he answered. "But how much, Joe?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Enough to cover my head," Joe answered. "Joe, you're going to have to learn how to count," said Mrs. Jules. "But Mrs. Jules, I already know how to count," said Joe. "Let me go to recess." "First count to 10, said Mrs. Jules. Joe counted to 10. 6, 8, 12, 1, 5, 2, 7, 11, 3, 10. "No, Joe, that is wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "No, it isn't," said Joe. "I counted until I got to 10. "But you were wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "I'll prove it to you." She put 5 pencils on his desk. "How many pencils do we have here, Joe?" Joe counted the pencils. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. "There are 5 pencils, Mrs. Jules." "That's wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "How many pencils are there?" Joe asked. 5, said Mrs. Jules. "That's what I said," said Joe. "May I go to recess now?" "No," said Mrs. Jules. "You got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way. You were just lucky." She set 8 potatoes on his desk. "How many potatoes, Joe?" Joe counted the potatoes. 7, 5, 3, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. "There are 8 potatoes, Mrs. Jules." "No, there are 8, said Mrs. Jules. "But that's what I said," said Joe. "May I go to recess now?" "No, you got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way again." She put 3 books on his desk. "Count the books, Joe." Joe counted the books. 1,000, 1,000,000, 3. 3, Mrs. Jules. "Correct," said Mrs. Jules. "May I go to recess now?" Joe asked. "No." said Mrs. Jewls. May I have a potato? Asked Joe. No, listen to me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Mrs. Jewls. Now you say it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Joe. Very good, said Mrs. Jewls. She put 6 erasers on his desk. Now count the erasers, Joe, just the way I showed you. Joe counted the erasers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10, Mrs. Jewls. No, said Mrs. Jewls. Didn't I count right? Asked Joe. Yes, you counted right, but you got the wrong answer, said Mrs. Jewls. This doesn't make any sense, said Joe. When I count the wrong way, I get the right answer, and when I count right, I get the wrong answer. Mrs. Jewls hit her head against the wall 5 times. How many times did I hit my head against the wall? She asked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You hit your head against the wall 10 times, said Joe. No, said Mrs. Jewls. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. You hit your head 5 times, said Joe. Mrs. Jewls shook her head no and said, Yes, that is right. The bell rang and all the other children came back from recess. The fresh air had made them very excited and they were laughing and shouting. Oh, darn, said Joe. Now I missed recess. Hey, Joe, where were you? Asked John. You missed a great game of kickball. I kicked a home run, said Todd. What was wrong with you, Joe? Asked Joy. Nothing, said Joe. Mrs. Jewls was just trying to teach me how to count. Joy laughed. You mean you don't know how to count? Counting is easy, said Marisha. Now, said Mrs. Jewls. What's easy for you may not be easy for Joe, and what's easy for Joe may not be easy for you. Nothing's easy for Joe, said Marisha. He's stupid. I can beat you up, said Joe. Try it, said Marisha. That will be enough of that, said Mrs. Jewls. She wrote Marisha's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Joe put his head on his desk between the 8 potatoes and the 6 erasers. Don't feel bad, Joe, said Mrs. Jewls. I just don't get it, said Joe. I'll never learn how to count. Sure you will, Joe, said Mrs. Jewls. One day it will just come to you. You'll wake up one morning and suddenly be able to count. Joe asked, If all I have to do is wake up, what am I going to school for? School just speeds things up, said Mrs. Jewls. Without school, it might take another 70 years before you wake up and are able to count. By that time, I may have no hair left on top of my head to count, said Joe. Exactly, said Mrs. Jewls. That is why you go to school. When Joe woke up the next day, he knew how to count. He had 55,006 hairs on his head. They were all curly.
All right. I'm going to pause that. So that was cute. So that was Joe learning how to count. He was a little bit unsure how to count, and there's no reason to make fun of him for that. But like his teacher said, you'll learn it eventually. And as soon as he realized, whoa, I need to learn that before I lose all the hair on my head, he learned it the next day. So kind of a coincidence, kind of funny thing. All right, I'm gonna pull up the questions. Okay, you will have, I believe, 3 questions to answer. Let me scroll down to them. So we answered Mrs. Gorf. Some of you turned into me the first 2 questions. All right, and the last 3 are also part of this because this page is for chapters 2 and 3. So, question 3. What was wrong with the way that Joe was counting? Question 4. What happened to Joe the next morning when he woke up? And question 5, how many hairs did Joe have on his head? Okay, remember that you can go back to the story to answer these questions. There's no reason that you should just guess. So either go back and listen to what I was listening if you haven't been able to get on Epic, or go on Epic and find the book and go back to the page and answer the questions. Because it's good to have text evidence, so finding the answer in the book. Okay, well, I will see you third graders on Wednesday, or if you tune into my Zoom meeting tomorrow, I will see you tomorrow. All right, goodbye.